Great. Thank you, Steve. So as mentioned, two main agenda items today that we're going to be covering. The first is this topic of reimagination. And here we thought it'd be helpful to take a step back and share some examples beyond education. So share some examples that we're seeing both private sector as well as in the public sector, and how organizations are kind of using this moment to think, in addition to just their immediate response, think longer term. And then I'll hand it over to Jimmy to talk more about SCAs and kind of what we can learn about the approach that other organizations are taking and how that can be applicable to SCAs. So on the next slide, what we're seeing in COVID is that organizations are responding across really 5 steps. And we've spent some time in the prior webinars talking about really some of these first few steps. So, the step 1 is resolve. I mean, this is really what many organizations were facing in March and April in terms of the immediate challenges that COVID represents. What we've spent time on in the past few webinars is in terms of steps 2 and 3, really what we've called resilience and return. So planning for more the near-term challenges. How are you addressing the near-term challenges? And then obviously with return, all of the discussions we've had so far about planning for, for SCAs in particular, planning for the fall and the fall semester. When we look towards reimagination, this is something, and while on this page it looks sequential, this is something that we're also seeing a lot of organizations are actually addressing this in the midst of thinking about the return. So they're starting to think through, what are the big trends that are emerging with COVID, and trends that are likely going to continue for the long term, and how can they set aside resources? How can they set aside dedicated team members to really address some of the longer term trends, in both to anticipate how this could affect their industry, but also to take advantage of some of the trends to think about what the future models like. Step 5, reform. This is where also, in addition to not just return and reimagination, but this is about, are there when you think about the environment in which the industry is operating in, are there potential longer term reform efforts that might happen? And so we're not going to spend time on that today, but we're really going to focus first in this first section, both on what the return looks like and how reimagination is a bit different. On the next slide, so we wanted, just before we get into some of the examples, wanted to share kind of in terms of these phases of resilience and return, what this often looks like for many organizations is having dedicated resources like nerve centers stood up to manage the tactical challenges. And so this could be in terms of focusing on the immediate response to the crisis, and ensuring the safety and well-being of employees, focusing on initiatives that really need to be addressed in terms of the near term, or starting to think through resilience for the longer term. And we've shared this quote just from one CEO who shared, when in terms of this phase of resilience and return, this is very much about thinking forward 3 or 4 days. This isn't in terms of longer term, but this is very much near term immediate. On the next slide, in terms of what we see, kind of how reimagination is different, is this is much more about thinking about the longer term context of COVID. And how do you set aside teams? Some are, when we'll refer to this, what's being called as plan ahead teams, to really ensure that you have the team members, that you have the resources dedicated to not just addressing the immediate term, but really thinking about what this longer term is going to look like. And so some of the things that we're seeing plan ahead teams address, and that we're seeing organizations focus on as part of reimagination, this is in terms of, what are the uncertainties, what are the potential ongoing disruptions that might be in place? Are there any initiatives to launch, both that could help in the near term, but it also could help in terms of positioning over the longer term, really ensuring that any short-term initiatives that are undertaken or short-term actions don't potentially close doors on efforts that you might want to undertake over the longer term. And then also, is there any resource allocation that you might want to do, or bold moves, big bets to take that could really help in this context of knowing what some of the big trends are and how that could shift over the longer term. And so here we've shared a quote. This is from an airline CEO, but this is about, not being at a standstill. It's one thing to address the near-term crises, but it's really, are you able to change relative to the environment, to geopolitics? So more about focusing on the near term, but also having the time and space and the resource to also plan for the longer term. And so what we've teed up on this next slide is, if I've shared at a high level kind of what the return looks like, and more in terms of what really application of a lot of crisis management best practices, nerve centers, and also reimagination, what that kind of, and how that's different. And what we wanted to do, we thought it might be helpful, is to share, again, this is taking private sector examples, just to set the context in terms of what does return look like? And on the other hand, what does reimagination look like? So this first, kind of the first set of examples here is in terms of talent or your workforce. And here, one really interesting example is in terms of, over the past few months, that a global telecom company, they were able to redeploy 1,000 employees to a different line of effort, to essentially in terms of sales, and that they were able to retrain them in 3 weeks. So that's an immediate shift in terms of what that company was able to do given COVID. Versus in terms of talent reimagination, this is a pharmaceutical company saying they're going to move 30% of their sales workforce permanently to online. So this is in terms of a longer term shift, but they're saying now they're putting a stake in the ground, anticipating that this online type of remote capacity is something that they would need. So again, kind of immediate versus the long term, launching new business models. Again, and we're going to talk more about this, just about, in some of the retail and e-commerce trends. But here's the example of a retailer able to pivot to curbside pickup in 2 days when they'd originally planned an 18-month launch around that. Separately, and there's a lot of kind of news around partnerships and other efforts, in terms of reimagination, a movie theater chain, which is essentially saying they're going to partner with production companies in terms of shifting how they're going to distribute movie content, to moving more to a on-demand. So this is a longer term in terms of their distribution model. On supply chains, again, a near-term pivot from an outdoor gear manufacturer to produce PPE for the immediate kind of healthcare crisis, versus kind of the reimagination as a technology company saying they're going to shift over the longer term a business line to pharmaceuticals using a government loan in terms of shifting really the fundamental types of products that they're distributing. And again, taking advantage of the moment and thinking about how to fundamentally reimagine what products they're providing as a tech company. So on the next slide, what I want to share is kind of, we've teed this up in terms of kind of what the return, some of those immediate adjustments look like versus taking a step back and reimagining. And so here on this slide and the next, I'll illustrate a bit in terms of this trend of e-commerce. And I know kind of for many of you, this is probably actually like resonates deeply. I know for me personally, it does. I used to always buy my groceries at the grocery store. And now I'm 100% an online, grocery purchaser. And so kind of what we see here in terms of the shift around e-commerce is that it essentially took 10 years from the e-commerce penetration in the US to go from about 5% back in 2010 to about 15% in early Q1, 2020. What we saw is that really over the first, kind of in one quarter of 2020, that it went from about 15% to 35%. So about kind of what we would have anticipated, a 10 years growth occurred in just 3 months. So this is a significant shift in terms of e-commerce, in terms of consumer preferences and how they shop. And what we've also seen on the right-hand side is that we're seeing a lot of not just kind of more adoption of e-commerce, going to the same websites that people have always gone to, but we're seeing people are shopping new brands. They're shopping new websites. They're shopping, like I just mentioned, grocery stores, new grocery stores, and they're saying they intend to continue. So this is a big trend. And on the next slide, we wanted to share just the example of one company. So this is PepsiCo. They have said they recognize this trend during COVID, and they've taken steps to reimagine. And I'm going to introduce this 4-step framework that we're going to talk about in 2 examples here, and then hand it over to Jimmy to talk more in depth, and particularly in terms of how it applies to SEAs. But for Pepsi, what's really interesting is so they identified this trend. They saw that, in terms of shifting consumer behavior during coronavirus with more willingness to shop online. They also said that as a company, that they have strong e-commerce capabilities, and they had a lot of strong retail partnerships. And so they felt that they were well positioned to essentially move into step 3, which is design and launch. So to think through kind of how could they take advantage of this e-commerce moment to, as well as some of those other trends around willingness to shop different channels, to shop on different websites. In Pepsi, they launched 2 websites. They launched one pantry shop, another snacks.com. And what was new about this is they decided we're going to go direct to consumer. So rather than selling our products through grocery stores or selling our products through other sites, it's essentially end-to-end a Pepsi chain. And so going direct to consumer, D2C, and selling their products directly to consumers. And what they and so this is again taking advantage of the trend, designing a prototype, piloting it, launching it, and then going into step 4, saying we also really want to learn and iterate. We want to get the customer feedback. What are they saying, and adjust the model as they go. And so 2 other things that we thought were interesting about this Pepsi example. The first is the way they built their team. So they put together what I mentioned earlier, which is this plan ahead team, saying, bringing together the capabilities of different team members, that technology, insights, inventory, resources, to really make sure that they had the right people at the table to think about what is this trend and how can we take advantage of it. And it also is a very agile way of working in terms of kind of taking advantage of the trend, putting a team together quickly, and also being able to adapt and adjust the approach as they went. What we also want to share on the next slide is that it's not just private sector companies that are taking advantage of this moment or thinking through kind of what is the impact of COVID going to be, and how can we identify the trends, anticipate those trends, and take steps to address them. And so here, this is the example of an effort within Detroit. So essentially, Detroit had an existing Detroit at Work platform. And what they saw were some kind of different from e-commerce. That e-commerce trend was really about, and the Pepsi example was the example of a company wanting to take advantage of kind of new consumer practices. This Detroit example is much more about an effort within the city saying we're quite concerned about the trends we're seeing around workforce and talent issues. So seeing, about 2 to 42%. So a third of COVID-related layoffs or COVID-induced layoffs are anticipated to be permanent. And, and then the statistics in terms of restaurants, that 75% of independent restaurants that have closed won't reopen. So knowing that, COVID's going to have already has had a massive impact on employment, and that is anticipated to be longer term. So they essentially said, in terms of one of their initiatives, Detroit at Work, it was an existing platform. What could they do in terms of really helping develop more in-demand career pathways? So around healthcare, around information technology. And so what they decided to do was they launched a solution called Detroit Ready to Hire, which was meant to help with these career pathways in terms of speeding up existing plans to deliver online work readiness, job searching solutions, and doing this with an approach of updating and learning from what they launched. If you go to the next slide. Perfect timing to hand it to Jimmy.
Thank you, Leah. So now I'm going to try to take you through how you might apply this in your context, recognizing that we're all running a million miles an hour, and so I think it was a CEO quote earlier, having a hard time even thinking 3 to 4 days ahead. But on the next slide, there are 2 concepts here that Leah mentioned that I want to talk about again, and then talk through what it might look like in our context, not just in K-12 education, but also in our role in SEAs. On the left-hand side, to this point that we're all doing a million things, having a hard time thinking even 3 or 4 days ahead. The idea here is not that those of us who are thinking three and 4 days ahead and really just trying to get to the first day of school and through that first month of school are the same ones that are doing this thinking, or at least that it's just, between 10 p.m. and midnight that you do this thinking. The idea is and the way these other companies and these other organizations do it is actually we need to stand up a separate team, a plan ahead team, which is a small group of staff, not all of them executive level or cabinet level, that are responsible for looking ahead across emerging trends. It doesn't have to be 100% of their job, but space has to be cleared in their job to actually do this. These people probably come from cross-functional groups, from academics, from operations, from policy, from teacher support and human capital, but folks that can actually think and cover all corners of what's happening out in LEAs, but also how things work inside of the agency. And again, critically, this needs to be a group of people who explicitly have at least some portion of their plate cleared so that they can actually think about this. So that's part one. How do you clear up some space for a set of people to actually think about this? And then on the right, just to reiterate the 4 steps that Leah laid out, we can do this by first identifying new trends. What are those potentially permanent shifts that have happened in the last several months in our states that might endure and create an opportunity to do something differently? Step 2, what are our strengths as an SEA? What capabilities can we use? What tools in our toolkit can we use to complement, accelerate, make sure that we put our finger on the scale of any of these shifts to make sure that they create positive outcomes for students? And then how do we design and launch a set of actions, moves, ideas that we actually want to try to enable that? And how do we continue iterating and improving on the fly and with some level of rigor as we go? So I now want to talk through each of these 4 steps to give sort of a taste and some suggestions for how you might go about this. On the first step of identifying trends, we've laid out 5 here. There are certainly more. I imagine that each of these 5 exist in varying levels in each of your states. There are probably others that exist in your states. We wanted to lay out 5 just as thought starters, and then I'll talk through some of the evidence of what we're seeing nationally, at least, on a few of them. So the 5 that we've laid out are, first, a need for increased family engagement. Everyone who has a child in school has been thrown into the process, or in the spring was thrown into the role of monitoring potentially full-time what they're doing. Very different than at any time in the future. We're finding that the expectations around how much parents and family members want to stay involved in their child's education actually is likely to endure. Second, many places are out of necessity because of the challenge of simply the logistical challenges of covering more time with students in more space, in more blocks in the day, are unbundling the role of the teacher and experimenting with how to bring other adults, other staff members into supporting roles to be able to support students in that way. So we'll talk a little bit about that. We're seeing certainly an increased emphasis on whole child supports. The last several months have put the needs on this front in stark relief. It's also increased a lot of the experimentation for how schools and other partners can support this effort. Certainly, and we've spoken about this before, but in virtual learning, to the extent that we all build a new muscle and hopefully get this right and do this well, what could the future of this be? How could we take advantage of this new muscle 1, 2, 3 years down the line? And then finally, how do we rethink how to monitor student learning, both to make sure that we know where our students are so that we can tailor our instruction and our supports to them, but also to continue to meet the objectives of compliance that we need to do. So let me dive into a couple of these. I mentioned before we were all thrown into a different role with our children several months ago. This is what that actually looked like. So the data here is from a survey that was done in April across parents throughout the country, who on average before 2019 were spending less than 1 hour per week engaged in their child's learning. And since March, they've been spending 16 times that, so 13 hours. And you're all probably doing a little bit of math in your heads right now, figuring out, were you above that 13, were you below? But this is dramatic. And what's striking about this on the next slide is, while many parents hope that they don't literally have to be sitting at the dining room table with their children every day, they do want to stay involved. This is from that same survey in April. 69% of parents plan to have a better understanding of what their children are expected to learn in their new grade level than they did pre-COVID. 70% of parents say they want to know what material their children are missing right now and how their school is going to make that up. 73% of parents plan to seek a better understanding of where their children stand academically going forward. There was another survey done by USC a little more recently than this. The results just came out in the last couple of days. There's a link to it in the bottom right of this slide that sheds even a little more light on this. A quarter of families right now think that their children are going to be underprepared across all subjects. This, unsurprisingly, is most prevalent for non-white and low-income families. 5% of families say that they're going to be switching their child's school because of COVID. So 5% more than in the past we're making that level of choice and agency in their child's education. We also know that over the summer, more non-white and low-income families reported engaging with their children on academic experiences than did in previous summers. And families across the board are asking for more engagement from teachers, from their schools in this coming year. So this is a real trend that, and maybe these families are being optimistic about how engaged they want to be, but that there could be an opportunity for SEAs to help LEAs and schools take advantage of. For example, maybe as an SEA we could provide innovation funds to support LEAs in developing creative parent engagement models, and then share best practices with all LEAs. This is just one idea, but hopefully to inspire some other thinking for you. The next trend we want to share just a little bit of data and example about is on this concept of rethinking the role of the teacher. So on the left, this is one district that is considering pulling in non-core but certified staff into a range of roles. So you can see currently their staff is made up 50% of core teachers that are certified and able to teach in person. But they need more people to lead synchronous lessons and engagement with remote students when an in-person teacher is otherwise occupied. More people to oversee small group and individual activities for in-person classes when those in-person classes have to be more physically spread out. They need more people to lead classes as a grade level teacher would. And they need more adults to supervise and support remote students who are at school, who maybe don't have devices or connectivity or other conditions to be able to do the work at school or at their homes. And so what they've said is we have 25% of the rest of our staff that are also certified to teach and can play these roles, but maybe aren't typically. And so they're going to try putting some of these people in those roles to effectively create their amount of staff that can engage with students in these activities from 50% to 75%. So a 50% increase in the number of adults that can work with students. Another way that some schools are trying to experiment with this is to create multi-classroom leadership models where they're creating essentially pods of a master teacher, paraprofessionals, teacher residents, and others that are working on the same grade or subject, and then diversifying the roles of those individuals, similar across those activities that are on the left side of this page. So on this one, experimentation born out of necessity, is there something that could be learned, some benefit that could come from this? Perhaps you consider adjusting guidelines, so for teacher licensure or others, to allow for more flexibility in LEA teacher placement decisions, and then potentially follow this up with monitoring and evaluation to see what's really working and what is worth working. On the next page, the last trend we just want to highlight is this trend around whole child supports and the effect of COVID-19 on students' social and emotional state. We all know this is, anecdotally, we know this is potentially dramatic, but a couple of data points to kind of put numbers on this. In past recessions, we have found that when national unemployment increases by 5 percentage points, there is a significant increase in clinically meaningful childhood mental health problems. And keep in mind, we've gone from about 3 to 4% unemployment in January to 11% now. So we are north of the ballpark of this of the stat. So potentially dramatic increases here. The other data point is from China. So in the Hubei province, of 1,800 students there, 25% have reported having depressive symptoms after being restricted in the home for about a month. So the effects of quarantine, the effects of a lockdown, the effects of not being among peers because of COVID has already had an effect and a quantified effect. So here, just at the level of what is the current status, SEAs could potentially partner with some external research organization to find out in your state what is the true nature of the challenge. Survey students, parents, educators on the effect of COVID and students' emotional state, and then share this information with each LEA, either aggregated or disaggregated for their own students. We also know that historically, schools are a very significant conduit for students to report, for children to receive these services. 70 to 80% of children that receive care for mental health do so in a school setting. We also know, of course, that for children with intellectual and physical disabilities, nearly all therapies and services are received through schools. At the same time, while about a third of teachers are intentionally integrating social and emotional skill development into lessons, so aligned with best practice, about a third of teachers are not, and are still approaching this ad hoc, opportunistically, and have opportunity to do this more directly. So SEAs here could potentially set a statewide vision, highlighting the importance, and then facilitating some peer-to-peer sharing across LEAs for how they could do this better. But of course, it can't just be the job of the teachers. So on the next page, we show some examples of schools. And again, to illustrate what could be possible, not that SEAs are gonna actually make any of these connections or make these changes in schools. But across these schools, there are a couple of things I want to call out. One, they created a habit and a staff and school-wide habit around checking on students on a variety of dimensions. So not just the academics, but on their mental health, on their physical health, and their overall well-being. Two, they didn't do this alone. So while the school was a conduit for services, these schools also created networks and partnerships with their local community mental health organizations, social workers, and other experts. And three, they also got creative, especially in this time where many students are going to be remote. It'll be important to create connections that are not just about being in person and receiving services in schools. Many of us have already been exploring with this, but this school on the right here conducted daily Instagram-based school announcements to most directly meet students where they are. So those are the trends, and those are some inspiration for where you might try to act. The second step that we need to do is not just think about the external fact base, but what is our own internal fact base? And so we've shown here a handful of questions that you as an SEA might ask, similar to how PepsiCo said, what current capabilities do we have to meet this growth, this dramatic growth in people buying all their things directly online? SEAs can ask, for those trends that we may have identified that are happening in our state, what actually are we good at? So we can ask ourselves, of all these things, what is currently in our strategic plan? What is already within the strike zone of the priorities that we have right now? What has changed in the last 5 to 6 months in terms of our priorities that we want to keep? And then finally, what's actually taking up our time, both in the last 5 to 6 months, but in the last couple of years? Two, what have we been good at in the past? What have we successfully engaged on in the past? And where have we not had success? In particular, what new initiatives, what big sort of state shifting efforts have we taken on in the areas of sharing vision, funding, new policies, research and knowledge sharing, enabling LEAs to work with each other. But what evidence do we have of the kinds of things that we can do well and the kinds of things that we struggle with? Underneath that, what are our actual skills as an agency at all levels? And where do we have capabilities that capability gaps that we would need to fill if we were to do anything? But again, what is the honest assessment of where we are strong and where we are not? And then finally, as you reflect on the trends and going forward when we reflect on ideas, where are we as an SEA actually best positioned to execute versus where might another organization, or where might we find a partner organization or a partner agency to work with us on this? So once you have your fact base, both your external fact base and your internal fact base, it's time to start generating and prioritizing ideas. Now, from that fact base, you'll have a lot of ideas, both from simply seeing what others are doing, seeing what some of your LEAs are already doing in your own state, but seeing what your counterparts in other states might be doing, thinking about the types of things that you've done in the past, and likely when you're developing these fact bases, you're going to be engaging with a number of other stakeholders. Your leaders in the LEAs, your teachers, your families, other community members. And you're going to have a bunch of ideas. Maybe you have another brainstorming session to develop more ideas. But the idea here is to go gradually from idea all the way to an actual concept to launch. This is where the plan ahead team can really create, and this doesn't have to be long, it can be a couple of weeks of a series of sessions to go from long list of ideas to ideas that actually meet some set of criteria and a sweet spot of what's important to the state, what's going to move the needle, and what are we good at, to then getting a handful of ideas that you actually take from, maybe it could be this, to here's an actual plan. This is the thing that we would do. These are the outcomes we would want. This is how we would go about doing it, that you can then select from to actually launch. Key here is not everything will make it through the filter. In most cases, with other organizations that we've seen, you may start with a list of 25 to 30 ideas and end up doing 2. But this should be an intentional process of prioritization, fleshing things out more and more as we go. And then we also have to know that whatever we launch is not going to be perfect. And there are two main periods or 2 main ways that we can refine. The first is before we actually launch. So on that previous page, if we start with 3 or 4 concepts that we think are great, we could pilot it, beginning with a small pilot. In this case, we're talking through an example of a statewide online training for LEAs that LEAs can choose to use, aggregating best practices from other educators. So we could pilot this with 1 to 2 LEAs to participate in a monitored pilot, trying the new online professional development module, providing quick feedback. We can simply ask community members what they think, either just sharing the idea or a prototype of the platform. And then finally, before the launch, it's important to determine our key performance indicators, KPIs. So for every concept or every effort that we want to launch, what will success actually look like, both on the way and ultimately? So in this case, some KPIs could be the percentage of completion of programs, percent satisfaction from teacher surveys, if LEAs choose to use it and make it their own and provide to teachers directly. And then equally important to setting things up before an official launch is what to do after an official launch or rollout. It's important to collect ongoing feedback. It's important to track success against the KPIs that you defined. And it's important to continue doing external research. What's not on this slide, but it's critically important, is often you're going to have to kill ideas. Sometimes you might do it at the pilot stage. Sometimes you might do it if the community overwhelmingly says this is not a good idea. Sometimes you might do it a year in when things just aren't working the way you expected. But be ready to both iterate, but also at some points stop some ideas. So these are our 4 steps, but that's a lot. So we've also tried to suggest one thing that you can do to get started. And that one thing is make a calendar appointment, invite your chief and your cabinet members, to a 3-hour meeting to have a plan ahead visioning experience. The idea of this is really twofold. One is to get the leadership team together for a block of time to think ahead, and to get that leadership team together to think about who could our plan ahead team be. Again, it will likely be some people in the cabinet, but it will not be entirely composed of the cabinet. You'll have to bring others in. The work that we want to do before this visioning workshop will include asking for others for ideas. Consult some superintendents, some parents, other LEA leaders, other state partners, teachers, others in the internal teams, just to start getting ideas on at least those first 2 topics in the 4-step process. What things are changing in our states, potentially permanently, and what are we really good at? In this actual meeting, on the next slide, we suggest you could do 3 things. 1, think about where you are and where you've been. So look at the past 3 to 5 years of strategy documents and outcome metrics. See where you are as an SEA and as a state in education. And then ask cabinet members to reflect on what stands out to them about our historical successes and previous accomplishments. This will both get everyone in the mood out of the day-to-day and also start the conversation and the fact base on that second step of what are we internally good at, where have we had success. And the second part, allow yourself to actually think big. How are things going to change by 2025? And what does that mean for us? So this first visioning exercise is less about what do we want and more about what could be. What do we think a best practice school in our state might look like in 2025? What is happening now that might influence that? Will parents be engaged in totally different ways? Will the concept of whole child learning not be a concept anymore, but just be part of school? But what do we think the major shifts are that are going to endure, and what are they going to create in 2025 in a school? And then what do we want to have happen because of that? What are our objectives and outcomes we want to achieve by 2025? What are the biggest areas of strength we should continue to build on? And how has the last 6 months changed our aspirations or the journey to get there? But really give yourselves permission and space to think big, think beyond, and likely put down your phone to avoid the text messages about the next urgent matter in the hour or the day ahead. And then finally, spend an hour coming up with that list of ideas for step 3. In small groups, think about what levers can we pull as an SBA to achieve our goals? How might we have to change our current organization and ways of working to pull those levers? And what additional resources and/or inputs will we need? This will not be all of the work, but it'll be a really good start. You'll have grounded yourselves in where you are as a state. You'll have grounded yourselves in some hypotheses for big trends and big shifts that have happened. You'll ground yourselves in what you're good at as an SEA and some hypotheses for where you can really shine. And you'll also have a starter list of ideas that your plan ahead team can then take all of and move forward. Now, to enable that, 3 things are going to have to happen. 1, you're going to have to create some space, mostly for those people on the plan ahead team, but then also for the actual work that comes afterwards. This will mean stopping some activities that have happened before and curtailing some others. There are a couple of ways that we've described here that you could do this, many of which I'm sure you've done before. Taking a holistic, rapid review of your project portfolio, applying a prioritization checklist to everything that's happened. And then once you do that, making a clear and aligned decision as a cabinet and actually implement those decisions quickly. Some of these decisions may already have been made for you. There are some things that you absolutely must do, like compliance. There are others that you may have already stopped or deprioritized just because there hasn't been enough time in the day. But as you may get over the hump of some of the work from the summer, maybe that actually has created a void that you could choose to fill with something else new and different. And then finally, ask for individual team members when they when they return to work, for anyone whose job has changed, how might you actually be reallocating their talent? But the point here is it'll be important to create space both in the short term for people to spend time on the plan ahead team, but also more broadly for initiatives that are coming out, you'll have to stop doing some work. And then we've gotten started with the visioning workshop. We also need to figure out how to sustain the momentum. Because if all we do is a 3-hour visioning workshop, that'll be good, but it will practices to maintain participation and momentum. These are not all for chiefs to do, but it is important that chiefs role model and enable their cabinet to do some of these things and role model themselves. These are simple things. Communicate early and often, send a reminder note prior to and the day of the launch of a new effort, describing what we hope to have happen, why it's going to have happen, and then continue to communicate what's happening, updates with this, with the new initiative. It's important to do this broadly with the whole organization. Share high-level results, even if those results are hurdles or setbacks. This builds trust and shows that voices are being heard. It also shows that the work is hard and we're continuing on our commitments. And then finally, we should act on insights. Most dramatic of which are, if something's not working, stop. Describe that to everyone. Be transparent about what's going on. Again, these are simple things, but especially in a world where things are likely to be a little bit chaotic, or more than a little bit chaotic, for the next while, continuing to communicate that some of these things, thinking ahead to a next horizon of how we can actually shape the longer term, is critically important to keep that focus there. So I'll pause there. I would love to hear from any of you on either of these two questions here. What are some shifts that you've observed in your states as a result of COVID-19 that might endure, that might create some opportunities to make positive changes in the longer term? And how might your team begin this plan ahead conversation? Or for any of you who already have, what's it been like so far?